Simpson, as we have always done, indigenous freedom through radical resistance. As we have always done, Indigenous Americas, Robert Warrior, Series Editor, Chadwick Allen, Trans-Indigenous Methodologies for Global Native Literary Studies, Raymond D. Austin, Navajo Courts and Navajo Common Law, A Tradition of Tribal Self-Governance, Lisa Brooks, The Common Pop, The Recovery of Native Space in the Northeast, Kevin Brunel, The Third Space of Sovereignty, The Post-Colonial Politics of U.S. Indigenous Relations, Glenn Sean Coulthard, Redskin, White Mass, Rejecting the Colonial Politics of Recognition, James H. Cox, The Red Land to the South, American Indians, Writers, and Indigenous Mexico, Brennan Hokoito and Vijay Devadas, The Fourth Eye, Maori Media and Aotearoa New Zealand, Daniel Heath, Justice, Our Fire Survives the Storm, A Cherokee Literary History, Thomas King, The Truth About Stories, A Native Narrative, Scott Richard Lyons, Ex-Murs, Native Signatures of Ascent, Eileen Warrington Robinson, The White Possessive, Property Power and Indigenous Sovereignty, Jean M. O'Brien, First Thing and Lasting, Writing Indians Out of Existence in New England, Sherry Pasternak, Grounded Authority, The Algonquins of Barrier Lake Against the State, Stephen Saleta, Internationalism, Decolonizing Native America and Palestine, Leanne Bettasamoki Simpson, As We Have Always Done, Indigenous Freedom Through Radical Resistance, Paul Child Smith, Everything You Know About Indians Is Wrong, Lisa Tatanetti, The Queerness of Native American Literature, Gerald Weisenor, Bear Island, The War at Sugar Point, Robert Warrior, The People and the Word, Reader Native, Nonfiction, Robert A. Williams Jr., Like a Loaded Weapon, The Rehnquist Court, Indian Rights, and the Legal History of Racism in America. So the name of this book is As We Have Always Done, Indigenous Freedom Through Radical Resistance. Leanne Bettasamoki Simpson wrote this. Indigenous America was published by University of Minnesota Press, Minneapolis and London. The publication of this book was assisted by a request from Josiah H. Chase to honor his parents, Ella Rankin Chase and Josiah Hook Chase, Minnesota Territorial Pioneers. Title page, art, copyright, Leanne Marie Leda Charlie. Our treaty with the Hoof Nation and Bujana makes a lovely discovery where previously published in Leanne Bettasamoki Simpson, The Gift in the Making, from the Debway series published by Highwater Press 2013, reprinted with permission. The interview by Naomi Klein was previously published as Dancing the World into Being, a conversation with Idol, No More Leanne Simpson, Yes, magazine, March 5th, 2013, in reference to http www.yesmagazine.org, Peace, Justice, Dancing the World into Being, a conversation with the Idol, No More Leanne Simpson. Billy Ray Pelcourt Sacred was previously published at https nathansewin.wordpress. dancing the world into being in conversation with idle no more. Leanne Simpson. This is the website. I'm going back to when I was this is WordPress site. Okay. And I'm going back to where I was at, as we have done in Indigenous Americas. Reprinted with permission of the author. Copyright 2017 by the Regents of the University of Minnesota. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted into any form or by means electronic, mechanical photocopying, recording, or otherwise without the prior written permission of the publisher. Published by the University of Minnesota Press. By the Library of Congress, cataloging and publication data. Introduction. My radical resurgent present. No one. We shall bear brilliance as radical resurgence theory. Qui as resurgent method. The attempted dispossession of qui. National internationalism, national anti-capitalism, endlessly creating our indigenous selves. I like that one. That's number 6. The sovereignty of indigenous peoples' bodies, indigenous queer normativity, land as pedagogy. I see your light, reciprocal recognition and generative refusal, embodied resurgent practice and coded disruption, constellations of core resistance, and the conclusion toward radical resurgent struggle. Introduction. My radical resurgent present. I am writing this chapter on a gray, wet winter day in the cafe in the sports complex at Trent University as my 2 kids attend swimming lessons. The doors of the complex have Trent's logo on them. The French explorer champion sword jutting down to the waves, or as my elder Doug Williams often cynically jokes, the heart of Michi Shaggy nationwide. My kids pass the symbol with a casual, they should change that, and don't have it good, Mom. They have grown up in their territory. Learning with a community of artists, makers, and elders, a luxury that not all of us, including myself, have had. Because of that, I see a strength in them, and I don't see in myself. I see an ability to point out the name. Colonialism resists and even mobilize to change it. They know more about what it means to be Naishabe in their first decades than I did in my third. This intimate resurgence in my family makes me happy. Over a decade ago, I was listening to Doug speak to a group of Canadians in a coffee shop in downtown Peterborough, a city in central Ontario between Toronto and Ottawa. Peterborough is known to be a conservative hockey town, really a small city on the edge of cottage country. Doug wanted this audience to know where they were, and he began by telling them what the land used to look like. The non-native audience was nearly silent, transfixed by each sentence he spoke. So was I, because as he was speaking, I was recognizing that the land I know as my home has been devastated by settlement, industrial development, the construction of highways and roads, the Trent Severn waterway, and 4 centuries of dispossession. I understand that the landscape I knew as home would be almost unrecognizable to my ancestors, and I hadn't known previously that I could barely even imagine the worlds that had already been lost. shared as we drove around our territory in the months that followed. He pointed out where the Wendat villages used to be, where hunting grounds were located, the former locations of black oak savannas and tall grass prairies. I began to start my own talks with a narrative of what our land used to look like as a quick glimpse, albeit a generalized one, of what was lost, not as a warning of loss, but a way of living in the present that collapses both the past and the future, and as a way of positioning myself in relation to my ancestors and my relations. I want to do the same here in this book. Najawang, the place at the end of the rapids of Peterborough, is in the heart of the Mishi-Sabi, part of the Nishi-Haba nation, and we call our nation Kina Shishi, Nishi-Haba Ogame, the place where we all live and work together. Mishi-Sai, the Nishi-Haba territory is along the north shore of Chi-Nishi-Bishi, all Lake Ontario. Chi-Nishi-Bishi literally means big water, and we share the lake with the Rata Nika. Nakamishi-Sabi means at the mouth of the rivers, and that name comes from our history as people that spent time to the mouths of the river draining into Lake Ontario. We are travelers moving throughout the lands rather than settling in one place. We are the eastern doorway of the Nishi-Haba nation, and we have responsibilities to take care of our relationship with the Rahatoshibaka. We also have diplomacy with the Rasapintinaka Confederacy. There are at least 4 Wampum Belts treaties that remind us of the responsibilities as well. There is also a Wait in the Woods ceremony between the Kinchinana Mohawk and the Mishi-Sai Nashi. Diplomatically, we have always had close ties to the Wenda. They asked to live in the territory at different points in history, and we made agreements with them so that we could. There are Wampum Belts made, and the oral tradition has a lot of evidence that we lived together quite well. They lived in the longhouses and farms, and we were hunting and fishing, ricing and sugaring, traveling by the waterways. Mishi-Sai are Salmon people. Doug tells me that its own resident population of salmon that migrated all the way to the Stony Lake to spawn. We drank directly from the lakes, and that was a good thing, healthy thing to do. There was a large population of eels that also migrated to Stony Lake each year from the Atlantic Ocean. There was an ancient old growth forest of white pine that stretched from Curve Lake down to the shore of Lake Ontario, which had virtually no understory except for the bed of pine needles. There were tall grass prairies and black oak savannas where Peterborough stands today. The lakes were teeming with many or wild rice. The land was dotted with sugar bushes. The lakes were full of fish. It sounds idyllic because compared to now, it was idyllic. Our knowledge system, the education system, the economic system, and the political system of the Michi-Sai Naishiba were designed to promote more life. Our way of living was designed to generate life, not just human life, but the life of all living things. Michi-Sai Naishiba were travelers. We really traveled. We really settled, and this was diplomacy with other nations, and even in the protection of our land, stable governance structures emerged when necessary and dissolved when no longer needed. Leaders were also recognized, not self-appointed, and then disengaged when no longer needed. It was an emergent system, reflective of relationality of the local landscape. I think of our system of governance as a breathing contraction and release. There was a high degree of individual self-determination in Mishishae Nation society. Children were full citizens with the same rights and responsibilities as adults. They were raised in a nest of freedom and self-determination. Authoritarian power, aggressive power that comes from coercion and hierarchy wasn't a part of the fabric of Mishi Said and Yeshiva philosophy or governance, and so it wasn't a part of our families. People were expected to figure out their gifts and their responsibilities through ceremony and reflection and self-actualization, and that process was really the most important governing process on an individual level, more important than the gender you were born into. In the context of gender fluidity and sexualities and relationship orientations outside of colonial conceptualizations, I see this idea of freedom as one that permeated the fabric of pre-colonial Nishiabag society. When Champlin visits us and refers to the freedom of our children within our society and our non-punitive attachment-based parenting, it is white male way of acknowledging that freedom and authentic power. His sword did not pierce the hearts of the Mishi Saye Nation. We are still here. Over the past 200 years, without our permission and without our consent, we have been systematically removed and dispossessed from most of our territory. We have fought back as our homeland has been stolen, clear-cut, subdivided, and sold to settlers from Europe and later cottages from Toronto. The last eels and salmon navigated our waters about 100 years ago. We no longer have old-growth white pine forests in our territory. Our rice beds were nearly destroyed, all but one tiny piece of prairie in Alderville has been destroyed. Most of our sugar bushes are under the private, non-native ownership. Our most secret places have been made into provincial parks for tourists, where concrete buildings cover our teaching rocks. Our burial grounds have cottages built on top of them. The rivers have lift locks blocking them. The shores of every one of our lakes and rivers have cottages or homes on them, making it nearly impossible for us to launch a canoe. Our rice beds have been nearly destroyed by raised water levels from the Trent Severn waterway. Boat traffic and sewage from cottages. We live with the ongoing trauma of the Indian Act. Residential schools, day schools, sanatoriums, child welfare, and now an education system that refuses to acknowledge our culture, our knowledge, our histories, and experience. At the beginning of the colonial period, we signed early treaties as international diplomatic agreements with the Crown to protect the land and to ensure our sovereignty, nationhood, and way of life. We have fought against the gross and blatant injustice of the 1923 Williams Treaty and its basket clause for nearly 100 years. A treaty wasn't a treaty at all within our political practices, but another termination plan, heralded as the first modern day treaty. It resulted in 89 years without hunting and fishing rights. My grandmother grew up eating squirrels and groundhogs because if her parents were caught hunting deer or fishing, they were criminalized. In the fall of 2012, as a result of civil suit, the province of Ontario sent us a letter indicating that it will recognize our treaty rights secured in an earlier 1818 treaty over 100,000 acres in southern Ontario. We will see. We have been living our understanding of our rights, and nearly every since the treaty was signed, people are charged by conservation officers for hunting and fishing out of season. This is the context within which I experience resurgence. This is the very real urgency of resurgence. Mishi Sayi, Sanishi Bam, like other indigenous people living in the most urban and industrialized parts of Canada, have virtually no land left to be Mishi Sayi Naishi. There are very few places to retreat to the bush, and almost none where you can't hear the rumble of traffic or run into a cottager or tourist. My kids regularly remind me of this. On their first visit to Yellowknives Dene First Nation territory, they remarked that they could be more Nishnawbe in Dene territory than in their own. They asked why they are no police or white people watching us fish 100 kilometers off grid outside of the Sambiki Yellowknife. Settler surveillance for them is a normalized part of being on the land. They also expect that we will be there anyway in spite of environmental destruction, despite the violence of surveillance culture, because they were born into a centuries-old legacy of resistance, persistence, and profound love that ties our struggle to other indigenous peoples in the Americas and throughout the world. It is not happenstance or luck that indigenous peoples and our land still exist after centuries of attack. This is our strategic brilliance. Our presence is our weapon. And this is visible to me at every protest, every mobilization, every time a two-spirit person gives us what they dance at our powwows, every time we speak our truths, every time we embody indigenous life. It is visible to me in the Unistototan camp in the hearts of Moose High Tanners against fascism and Dunedin, and the work of the Native Youth Sexual Health Network in the 40 years of mobilization against mercury contamination and deforestation at Grassy Narrows First Nation in Ellis Paktak, Kanashita, Lagoon, and of course in the phenomenal mobilization against the Dakota Access Pipeline in Standing Rock, North Dakota, by the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe and the Oseti Sakowin, the Great Sioux Nation. It is visible to me when we refuse to replicate transphobia and anti-blackness in our territories. It is our ancestors working to ensure we exist as indigenous peoples, as they have always done. From this standpoint, it doesn't matter who is president or prime minister, because our most important work is internal, and the kinds of transformations we are compelled to make, the kind of alternatives we are compelled to embody are profoundly systemic. I am strongly interested in building an Anishinaabe present, Anishinaabe present that embodies and operationalizes the very best of our nation, because this is what we have always done. My ancestors struggled, sacrificed, and fought much worse than I have to get me here, and I have the same responsibility to my future relations. So I read the introduction, and I did not pronounce many of the words correctly, but I just wanted to get through the reading so I can get a feeling or a discernment of what the book will be about, because I received this reference from AI, artificial intelligence, and I wanted to know if the artificial intelligence would give me the right kinds of references for what I wanted to write about, so that I can read the right intelligent information. And so far, I've received mixed messages about this introduction. It's not it's more modernized. It's like a diversity inclusion kind of feeling to me. Doesn't seem like it's the indigenous that resisted diversity and inclusion. It's not a pure indigenous. It's more like a multicultural indigenous, ethnogenesis indigenous. So that's just my judgment going in. I have to actually read this whole book, and I'm not going to read it all at this moment, but I'm going to just start with this book, because this was actually only one of the books I could find, and it was online through the library, and it's one of the let me see how many references I had. Actually 1, 2, 3, 4. I had 4 references here, and only could find this one reference out of the 4. I was looking for Braveheart, and that one, the author name is Braveheart, and the book was called The Return to the Sacred Path, Healing from Historical Trauma and Historical Unresolved Grief Among the Lakota. And it's really a document published by the Smith College Studies in Social Work. So it's really a research paper. So I probably have to have access to the college research journals to find that. And then it might be through the Google, I'm not sure, I'll try them too. And then I had another reference from the artificial intelligence called Hoaxy, F-E, and published in 1984. It was called The Final Promise, The Campaign to Assimilate the Indians. It was published by the University of Nebraska Press. And another book was published in 2012 by W.L. Katz called Black Indians, A Hidden Heritage. And when I looked that one up, it's a children's book. So I thought that was odd that the artificial intelligence would give me a children's book. I still haven't seen the quality of the children's book because I haven't been able to find that yet. But I did find this one, and it was available on Kindle or either the I think I forgot the name of this, Over Press. So I'm reading it online, like previewing it. But I don't think these gonna be the type of books I want to use for the paper I'm trying to write. Let me just take a preview, take a quick look through these. I am not a nation state. Nishna'abeg, brilliance as radical resurgence theory. That's the beginning. And then Nishna'abeg as grounded normativity. I got a feeling it has some gay ubiquitous stuff in here. Ubiquitous. It seems like it's going to be ubiquitous in here. And I did mention something about black too. Queen as resurgent method. I need to look up some of these words and see what they mean. The Radical Resurgent Project. The attempted dispossession of Queen. I need to find out what Queen is. Colonialism and current Queen. Radical resurgence. Centering gender and resurgence. See, now this is what I'm talking about. What they mentioning this stuff for. And that radical stuff. I'm not looking for that type of information. Anishinaabe internationalism. So they're going internationalism. Might be multiculturalism. Anishinaabe anti-capitalism. Endlessly creating our indigenous selves. I'm going to just take a preview of this real quick. For the past few years, when I talk about gender and indigenous post-secondary classrooms, primarily classes on self-determination, resurgence, and governance, I lead the students through a simple exercise to begin. As a group, I ask them to list all the stereotypes they have been the target of or have heard about indigenous women. So she's an indigenous woman, and I believe she's trans, or either ubiquitous. There is a moment of pause after I outline an exercise, and I always make sure I look into the eyes of indigenous women, because I know they are wondering if this is a safe thing for them to participate in. And they are wondering, why am I asking them to go to such a horribly painful place inside themselves? Often I will start by writing the word slut on the flip chart or chalkboard and explain that for as long as I remember, going way back into my history as a girl of 5 or 6, people have associated me and my body with this word. I explained this term is used by colonialism to regulate and control my body and sexual behavior. And I explained that I have sovereignty over my body, my sexuality, and my relationships. So what's this about? This is talking about her sexuality. I explained that many women and 2SQ people, who are the 2SQ people? I gotta look that up. People have reclaimed this word as a mechanism for enacting their own self-determination, values, and ethics over their bodies. There are always nods and eye drops to the ground. The class adds to the list: dirty, squaw, bad mothers, lazy, promiscuous, irresponsible, addicts, criminals, prostitutes, easy, bad with money, bad wives, dumb, stupid, hysterical, angry, wild and bad, useless, drunks, worthless, without villain, violent, weak, partiers, alcoholics. After the first 3 or 4 stereotypes are on the list, they come faster, and the energy starts to shift from shame and hurt to an expulsion of those same things. Heads are held up high as we name and then cast off and cast out the internalized racism and patriarchy of the colonizer. Then I asked the group to list all of their truths about indigenous women. Intelligent, strong, brave, courageous, sexy, committed, hardworking, good mothers, partners, wives, loving, caring, honest, brilliant, spectacular, empathetic, compassionate, beautiful, smart, kind, gentle, good lovers, organized. We do the same for the indigenous men and for the queer community. Notice with some of the ubiquitous groups come up with the between 30 to 50 gender stereotypes specific to each gender and gender sexual orientation. They come up with beautiful lists of truths, and in essence, all three lists are the same. In one class at the land-based Chinta Center for Research and Learning, the women of the group came up with the list of racist stereotypes for indigenous women. As the instructor, I often have to start the process because it is too painful for young indigenous women to even speak with this group. When it came time to list the troops, they were silent, and then something really profound and transformative happened. The then men in the group made a beautiful list that left nearly everyone in the room in tears. Smart, intelligent, beautiful, sexy, good mothers, good partners, strong, connected, spiritual, good hunters, good fishers, good providers, excellent sisters, aunties, and grandmothers, powerful. When we got to the part of the exercise where we listed the positive things about men, the women did the same. And then the group came together and generated a list for 2SQ people. During our discussion of 2SQ people, we talk about sex, gender, or sexual orientation. In the relationship orientation, we talk about terminology and pronouns. We talk about transphobia and how our bodies are real bodies. We talk about how groups with the highest rate of suicide in our communities are 2SQ people and trans youth. We talk about how learning on land can be a safe space, or it can be a nightmare for trans youth. This particular time I did the exercise was special. It was movement for everyone involved. As the men listed our positive attribute after positive attribute, women, myself included, were emotional because we have told over and over again through pop culture, the mainstream media, our experiences with the church and Indian affairs by teachers and parents that we are all of the things on the negative list. This was perhaps the first time in our lives we have been told directly that we are not any of those things, and to have it come from our Denny Mills colleagues was extremely meaningful. It felt like they had our backs. This is one of the most powerful learning experiences that I have had in a classroom in my teaching career. The exercise is simple enough in itself. The act of naming stereotypes is a commanding space because it brings my attention to the very personalized violence of colonialism on my internal thoughts and beliefs about myself. When I write the word slut on a chart, I am thinking and feeling every time that the word has been used to push me down, control me, and limit my potential. When I write down on the chart, I can't help but to reflect on how that internalized belief is so implanted in me by settler colonialism that I have to remind myself every time I speak or sit down or to write or walk into the classroom that I'm not actually dumb. Each time I participate in this exercise, it reveals to me the degree to which I have unconsciously internalized these lies, and that we as communities of people have unconsciously internalized these lies, and it provides a chance to speak back. The next layer is a collective realization that we all, varying degrees, carry around these unconscious colonial beliefs about ourselves, despite the fact that some of us have obtained measures of success in indigenous worlds, settler colonial society, or both. This begins to shift the power dynamics between the students and me, and how the class sees me as an indigenous woman instructor. I am no longer better than them because I have a PhD PhD or because of my past successes, I have not been removed from the violences of settler colonial life. I carry the same damage as they do, and I am not ashamed of that damage because the shame does not rest within the indigenous peoples, but with the settler colonial Canada. As the group moves through the exercise, the energy of the class moves from shame and humiliation to celebration and joy to happiness. We talk about how good it feels to recognize when our people recognize our positive attributes and see us through the then or national eyes rather than through the eyes of settler colonialism. We talk about how good that feels in ourselves, and we pause and feel it. We link our personal feelings and experiences with the other subjects of the course, the Indian Act, residential schools, the public education system, self-government policy, the criminalization of indigeneity, environmental destruction, gender violence, and students begin to realize that the negative beliefs that carry within themselves were planted in them in the generations that came before them for a very specific reason, dispossession of their lands. We talk about how shame prevents us from connecting to our loved ones, learning our languages, and being on the land. We are honest about the stereotypes of other genders and sexual orientations that carry and amplify in our own lives. People bring up stories of grandmothers chopping wood, hunting, trapping, and fishing, and of grandfathers cooking, sewing, and doing childcare. We talk about binaries and fluidity around gender. I don't care to hear that. And how in indigenous context it is often important that we all have a baseline of skill and knowledge about how to live. Oftentimes someone will bring up a relative who didn't fit so easily into the colonial gender binary. And we talk about how the community, the church, and the state responded and responds to this. We talk about how we gender the land in English and if this is the same in their languages. We talk about indigenous men and how all genders have experienced and do experience gender violence, although it affects individuals in asymmetric ways because of their hierarchy and it instills. We talk about how indigenous peoples are in a difficult position, simultaneously being targeted by gender violence and therefore carrying trauma, benefiting to varying degrees from hierarchy and oftentimes knowingly or unknowingly perpetuating gender discrimination, violence, and anti-queerness. We talk about how difficult it is, how difficult it can be to hear that in action or phrase is hurting indigenous women or to SQ women. We talk more about shame. Inevitably, someone will ask if some of the stereotypes are true, often referring to the epidemic of gender violence in our communities. And if the students themselves don't bring that up, I do, because I know someone is thinking about that. We talk about the nature of stereotypes. We talk about how we are not the sum of the list of stereotypes. We talk about how stereotypes are not just backward thinking, but a system of social control. We talk about consent, accountability, self-determination, responsibility. We acknowledge how all genders, including indigenous men, have been the target for sexualized and gender violence. We talk about how that is not an excuse for perpetuating it. We account for things. I ask them to pick one of the stereotypes from the negative list. I use my own nation as an example and draw a rough trajectory that cuts through 4 centuries of heteropatriarchy as a tool of dispossession. Nishina and Meg, people have this self-determination over their bodies and sexuality. Sex is not shameful within Nisha all genders and ages hold political power and influence. There is a diversity of genders, sexual orientations, and relationships orientations, and respect for body sovereignty. Colonizers want land, but the indigenous bodies forming nations are in the way because they have a strong attachment to the land or to land, and because they replicate indigeneity, all indigenous genders as political orders also replicate indigenous nationhood, but the colonizers are looking through the eyes of heteropatriarchy, so they see indigenous women's and girls' bodies as the bodies that reproduce nations, and they see 2SQ bodies as the biggest threat to their assimilation and dispossession project. Colonizers noticed that women, children, and 2SQ people hold power and influence in indigenous governance. They noticed this is not the same in European nations. Hierarchy is key to their system of control. During times of violent conflict, sexual and gender-based violence is widely recognized as a tactic of both war and genocide because it is frequently used as a military tactic to harm, humiliate, and shame, and because violence and war weaken systems of protection, security, and justice. Sexual violence is an effective colonial tool in genocide and dispossession because the damage it causes to families is so overwhelming that it makes it very difficult to have the emotional capital to continue to resist. Indigenous nations are attacked physically and symbolically through things like the Indian Act, policy, colonial laws, and fraudulent and unfair treaty negotiations at the same time as they are coping with violence, land loss of an economic base, and disease. Indigenous nations lose political power and can no longer hold settlers accountable in their lands. There are fewer indigenous bodies on indigenous lands. We are confined to reserves. We are governed by the heteropatriarchy and the settler colonialism of the Indian Act. Our children are in residential or day schools. We are rewarded with recognition when we assimilate. The gender binary is introduced and reinforced through residential schools. The church and the Indian Act, 2SQ people are disappeared. Indigenous women are domesticated into the role of Victorian housewives. Native men are domesticated into the wage economy and taught their only power is to ally with white men in the oppression of indigenous women through church, school, law, and policy. Christian beliefs about heterosexual monogamous church relationships and sexuality are infused with the community through missions and residential schools and reinforced by Indian agents. Propagation of negative stereotypes of indigenous women, men, and 2SQ people is widespread in popular culture, as evidenced in the first newspaper reporting on indigenous peoples in Canada. Canadian society through the media, books, and oral culture continues to justify the strangulation of indigenous women's body sovereignty and to justify the violence against indigenous women, which has led to the epidemic of murder and missing indigenous women and girls. Indigenous women are blamed by the state for causing the violence by making poor lifestyle choices. And indigenous men are named as the perpetrators of this violence. Canadian citizens born into the heteropatriarchy and normalized gender and sexualized violence against indigenous peoples replicate this violence in their personal lives with structural support of the state's legal, education, and political system, disconnected from land and our knowledge systems and the targets of 4 centuries of state violence. We replicate the violence we experienced in our communities. We as a class can list in less than 30 minutes nearly 100 stereotypes of indigenous peoples, and many of us hold particular ones inside us that makes us feel not good enough. At first, they are surprised. Nishiabag, Nishiabag, Nishna Ebag, Nishna Ebag, professor from the South with degrees in the privileged credentials, gives me still sometimes believes the worst about myself because colonialism has conditioned me to do so. This reframing, though, illuminates the deliberate nature of this on the part of the colonizer to get land, and that when we repeat it and live it, we are helping the colonizers. This critical reframing, drawing on issues already discussed in class, then offers students a new orientation to themselves and their communities, one in which the interrogation of colonialism, the historical context, and the resistance of the indigenous peoples figure prominently. It is the approach Mohawk scholar Audra Simpson takes in her fantastic book, Mohawk Interrupts, that there are signposts in our nation's communities and bodies of colonialism's ongoing existence and simultaneous failure. She writes, colonialism survives in a settler form. In this form, it fails at what it is supposed to do. Eliminate indigenous people, take all their land, absorb them into a white property-owning body politic. Kanakawa debates over membership index colonialism's life as well as its failure in their own life through their grip on this failure. This is a subtle and elegant shift in our analysis of indigenous politics because it proves the proper and truthful context within which our analysis can take place. This approach also nests and confounds polarity. Colonialism is violent and evil, and indigenous peoples agree on that. And we have a range of responses to that horrific and ongoing violence that is ultimately rooted in a fog of love, anger, fear, shame, pride, and humiliation. For Simpson, the issue of membership is not about whether we should kick white people off the reserve. The fundamental question her people are grappling with is how do we continue to exist as the Kamanaka people in the face of settler colonialism elimination. Simpson emphasizes debates over membership because this could be any issue in indigenous political life. You can replace that phrase with debates over land protection, debates over governance, debates over gender violence, because her intervention is that we need to shift our lens of analysis from one that plays into the limits of Western thought to one that is wholly and diversely indigenous at its core, both in experience and intellectual thought. But that brings with it the most robust critical analysis of our times. Following Simpson's intervention on framing, I want to use the pain and anger that heteropatriarchy strikes to reject the replication of settler and colonial gender violence within our bodies, communities, and nations. We need all genders to do this, and we all need to think critically about how how we replicate this in our communities and in our daily lives, placing the interrogation of heteropatriarchy at the center of our nation-building movements ensures that our nation-building counters the impact the settler colonial or political economy has on indigenous bodies, intimacies, sexualities, and gender. It counters the continual violent attack on bodies and intimacies, sexualities, and gender as a dispossessing force. We have a choice. We can choose to uphold white heterosexual masculine control over indigenous bodies, or we can choose to collectively engage in the dismantling of heteropatriarchy as a nation-building project. Nation-building in indigenous context is a collective effort, and in critically undoing the gender hierarchy, what happens to indigenous women, children, and to us Q bodies is the measure of our success as nations. Stereotypes are not attitudes that can be changed by using a different terminology. They are windows into the pervasive logics of white supremacy and heteropatriarchy, and how they operate through time and space in Canada on my body and mind as a indigenous woman. These terms are part of a much more omnipresent and ubiquitous system of control that has stolen not only my land from me, but also my body and the way I think about my body. I am not murdered and I am not missing, but parts of me have been disappeared, and I remain a target because I was born a Native woman and I live as queer. Students at the Chinta have already heard me talk about consent and individual self-determination within the context of indigenous politics. And so we then talk about creating these alternative systems of accountability. I use the example of the Community Holistic Circle Healing Project in Hollow Water First Nation and Nishnawbe community on the east side of Lake Winnipeg in Manitoba. We talk about how this group found that 80% of their residents had experience with sexual abuse, and how they use Nishnawbe processes of accountability to create a community-based alternative to the Canadian criminal justice systems for cases of sexual violence. We talk about how this system requires the admission of guilt on the part of the perpetrator to proceed. There is a truth telling as the first step. The circle of healing involves support for all of the individuals and families involved. It involves the perpetrator witnessing the full impacts of his actions. It involves the larger community witnessing the full impacts of sexualized violence and accounting for how we contribute to the epidemic levels of violence in our communities. It involves ceremony and Nishnawbe practices of regeneration. It involves regenerating relationships. Students often share their frustration with the criminal justice system and with our communities in terms of how we handle these issues. They often have a wealth of ideas for visioning systems of accountability in their own lives. Thinking back to the Bush classroom at the Chinta and Deneda, I learned something else important that day. I learned that I want, but don't necessarily need, indigenous men to have my back. I don't want to be continually seeking out the solidarity, the recognition of white women because I want the solidarity of straight, cisgender, indigenous men. I want them to stop exploiting, abusing, and degrading women and children. I want them to stop engaging in systemic, structural, and casual sexism and patriarchy. I want them to hold each other accountable when there are no women around, and casual and not so casual sexism in the form of the objectification, ongoing criticism, and other forms of white patriarchy into their social, personal, and professional lives. I want them to hold each other accountable when casual and not so casual homophobia, transphobia, heterosexualism, and all forms of anti-queerness appear. I want them to support and assist and to be critically engaged in, but not lead the dismantling of heteropatriarchy as the crucial nation-building exercise of our time. I want them to see that they have been targeted by white men working strategically and persistently to make allies of indigenous men, with clear rewards for those who come into white masculinity imbued with heteropatriarchy and violence in order to infiltrate our communities and nations with heteropatriarchy and then to replicate it through generations with the purpose of destroying our nations and gaining easy access to our land. White supremacy rape culture, although Sarah Hunt recently reminded me that when rape happens to us, it rarely named as a rape, and the attack on the gender, sexual identity, agency, and consent are very powerful tools of colonialism, settler colonialism, and capitalism, primarily because they work very efficiently to remove indigenous peoples from our territories and to prevent reclamation of those territories through mobilization. These forces have the intergenerational staying power to destroy generations of families as they work to prevent us from intimately connecting to each other. They work to prevent mobilization because communities coping with epidemics of gender violence don't have the physical or emotional capital to organize. They destroy the base of our nations and our political systems because they destroy our relationships to the land and each other by fostering epidemic levels of anxiety, hopelessness, apathy, distrust, and suicide. They work to destroy the fabric of indigenous nationhoods by attempting to destroy our relationality by making it difficult to form sustainable, strong relationships with each other, dismantling heteropatriarchy and generating moves of scholarship, organizing, mobilizing, and living that no longer replicated but must be a core project of radical resurgence, centering the voices of children, women, and two SQ people within the Radical Resurgence Project is a mechanism through which to counter the gender nature or of heteropatriarchy and build systems of consent, accountability, and agency so that all indigenous political orders are valued, cherished, and celebrated as a crucial part of our communities and nations, and fully engaged in the regeneration of alternative indigenous worlds. Indigenous freedom means that my sovereignty over my body, mind, spirit, and land is affirmed and respected in all of my relationships. The sovereignty of indigenous people's bodies I've taught the Indian Act and its devastating impact on indigenous nations for over 15 years in various indigenous studies courses. I talk about the consolidation of legislation that led to the first act in 1876. I discuss the most oppressive forms of the act, the banning of the sun dance and potlatch ceremonies, the pass system, the imposition of chief and council administration, the restrictions on organizing and hiring legal counsel, and so on. I make a point of how this undermined the political influence of indigenous women through the patriarchal rules related to leadership and elections. We discuss the patriarchal nature of status and membership clauses, and I highlight the resistance of indigenous women and our organizing related to Bill C-3-1 and Bill C-3. I present all of this as the historical fact that it is. And in doing so, I present a fairly straight masculinist view of the Indian Act. That is, I don't fully interrogate the targeting of indigenous women in the 2SQ community, and therefore I obfuscate the gender nature of colonialism and the Indian Act. I underreport the targeting of indigenous women in the 2SQ community and Indian policy, targeting that has directly and indirectly impacted me and the women in my family in violent ways. I was not conscious of the underreporting until I sat through a lecture on the Indian Act by a male colleague, a friend of mine, and I felt a swell of emotion in me, strong feelings of anger, injustice, and erasure. At first, I thought it was me, that I couldn't somehow support my friend and colleague doing what was, by all standards in the indigenous studies, a very thorough and complete discussion of the Indian Act that highlighted gender in the same way that I did. But my experience of this lecture as essentially a student or as someone who wasn't directing the content or the discussion was one of profound disempowerment. My first reaction was to blame myself. Why couldn't I cope with not being in charge? Why was I angry with someone who has always had my back? What was untrue about what my colleague was saying? Was this just a trigger for my own unprocessed shit? Was I being hysterical? I sat with this. I hiked around the bush with this. Eventually, I uncovered a tiny part of me that was saying that there was a strong disconnect between my lived experience as queer and how the Indian Act and its implications had been discussed in class. That the women in my family experienced the loss of status and then some of us gained it back was only part of the deep pain inside of me. The rest of the pain stemmed from the racist stereotyping of indigenous women as promiscuous sluts, dirty, unfit mothers, stupid, angry, apolitical, useless, skillless, bad, crazy, unstable, disposable beings, which then became codified in the Indian Act and to some degree remains encoded in the Indian Act. And not just the stereotypes. My family, like all indigenous families, has directly suffered under the colonial systems that white supremacist hatred has justified, including a child welfare system, disease, imposed poverty, addictions, mental health issues, and even death. I sat with the trees in this pain, trying to make sense of things, like I am now trying to figure out why the word squaw, slut, dirty Indian, and stupid have so much power